When you look at cities around the world, or RM transit videos, you'll see a lot of buses and a lot of subways. But the truth is that there are a lot of technologies which fill the gap between buses and subways. What's interesting is that when you look at Germany and France, two countries which I've covered a lot on this channel and two countries where I think we can learn a lot from the transit, you'll see two very different answers to the question, what's the middle solution? And around the world, from Seoul to Rotterdam and from Copenhagen to Valencia, you'll typically see transit solutions that align with one of these two answers. So I thought it made sense to make a video to review medium capacity transit. It's not mass, it's not micro, it's very nicely medium. Let's dive in. Hi, I'm Reese and this is RM Transit, a channel about how different places have different solutions to public transportation. One of the biggest problems a transit system has to face is what to do when a bus line gets busy, and I'm serious here. You can almost always run more buses, as the BRT systems in Bogota or Guangzhou show, but at some point moving to a rail system is just going to make sense. If you're curious about what rails can do that buses just can't, I have a whole video on that. The issue with the solution to a transit problem being rail is that rail is a huge category with tons of different technologies in it. From basic trams with only a little more capacity than buses, to massive RER systems and suburban trains that can move millions of people every single day. Now, if your city is big or growing really quickly, then a metro system is probably the correct solution. But what if your city is smaller or growing more slowly? What are the medium options for transit expansion? It's also worth considering that deciding to build a rail system for a city isn't necessarily a single corridor affair. After all, a lot of cities have built a large rail system with multiple lines at once or in quick succession. And so it's worth asking whether it's better to build one or two high-capacity lines or a number of lower-capacity ones, and how all of those different lines are meant to interact. The answers to these questions are going to shape entirely different cities. If you go the lower capacity or medium capacity route, you'll tend to see two different solutions in France and Germany, which highlight two very different approaches to this problem and arguably to city building: the Stadtbahn and the automated light metro. What's interesting is that while there are French cities with trams and metros and German cities with trams and metros, there aren't really any German cities with a true automated light metro, and there aren't really any French cities with a true Stadtbahn, if one could be said to exist. But what are these technologies? An automated light metro is probably pretty obvious, you'd think. It's a train, it's automated. But I think it's worth highlighting a few interesting things. For one, automation isn't just a nice to have, but it kind of makes or breaks the whole thing. A big part of why trains make sense on a transit system is that a single operator can suddenly move far more people than they could with a bus or with a tram. But that means that transit systems or lines with operators usually head to bigger and bigger vehicles. And bigger vehicles aren't light. For the most part, the only way super high frequencies with tiny trains can make financial or economic sense for a transit system is to have one that's driverless. So the light part is kind of inherently tied to the automation, and that's true of the infrastructure as well. A small city looking to build a subway probably couldn't afford a full-size subway because of the large underground stations. So automated is important for the transit to be light, and light is important for the transit to be cost-effective to construct for a small city. So when automated light metro was arguably created with Lille's metro back in the late 20th century, it arguably wasn't just some new evolution of metro, but something entirely different that the world couldn't have seen without the driverless train technology. Now, there is the question of what is light metro, and it's something I've debated with people a lot. The conclusion I've basically come to is that 80-meter long trains and narrow, something like the SkyTrain, is probably light metro, and 80-meter trains and wide, like the Montreal REM, is probably heavier metro. Shorter than 80 meters is probably best considered light because you've only got 2 or 3 cars, and longer than 80 meters you're talking about systems like the London Underground and the Paris Metro, which most people don't consider to be light. The Madrid Metro kind of straddles the line, but that's fine. Madrid is a unique case. Stadtbahns, which I sometimes call city trains, something which people think is unique, but requires slightly more explanation. The idea with Stadtbahns, after German-speaking cities stopped naming their literal city railways after them, was to have a sort of hybrid tram and metro system that could ideally eventually be upgraded into a full metro system, sort of like the Brussels Metro. Because conversion into a metro was the end goal, the vehicles on these systems tended to have high floors, appropriate for the platforms and capacity that you'd someday want in a subway. But because they were also operated on surface streets, they also had to be able to negotiate tight curves and interact with pedestrians and vehicles. So what you ended up getting was a subway-style system in the city center and a tram or tram-train-style system out in the suburbs, though sometimes with multiple different subway-style sections throughout the region, where you'd go from subway to tram and then back to subway again. The nice thing about these systems was they were often pretty straightforward to build, since cities already had experience with trams, and these systems had tram-style tracks and tram-style overhead wires. But I think the kind of realization in cities like Frankfurt and Stuttgart is that Stadtbahns are good in their own right. The idea that a Stadtbahn needed to grow into a full metro system doesn't really make sense. It's sort of like suggesting that an S-Bahn system needs to eventually have a separate core trunk for every single branch. It sounds nice and it would be good as a capacity relief measure, but it's really not necessary. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of both models, and what do they mean for the shape of cities? Automated light metros are awesome because they mean high frequency along an entire route through a city, as well as huge capacity as a byproduct of that huge frequency. And on top of that frequency, which as Jarrett Walker says is freedom, and as I say is speed, also comes speed and reliability, because these lines don't have to interact with pedestrians or road vehicles, they're subways. In fact, they probably even have platform screen doors at the stations. This gives you a great network backbone that is fast, frequent, and reliable. All of the features of a big city subway, but in a smaller city at a lower cost, and not just to build, but also to operate, which is really important. Automated light metros are probably also the best technology for the ridership uncertainty that the future holds. And I'm not talking about uncertainty about whether people will ride, but when they'll ride. People traveling for journeys that aren't necessarily commutes to work and going to events and entertainment. In fact, maybe even overnight trips. Copenhagen, with its automated light metro, for example, is basically alone with New York City for operating 24-hour service 7 days a week. But it's not all positive. That metro-style infrastructure, while nice and while enabling great things, is more expensive and more complex to gradually expand and upgrade than what you would see with a Stadtbahn. So you're more likely to see expansion that is in the form of a new line every 5 or 10 years than gradual upgrading with new branches and stations. By their very nature, metros also tend to concentrate service, so you'll have less places with rail, but more rail transit to those places. This encourages higher density that concentrates along your rail routes. Probably the most exciting thing about Stadtbahns is that they can be built on the cheap, and when transit is cheap, you can get more transit. Basically instantly, if you opt for a Stadtbahn, you can lay more rail for less. But it's important to remember that there is no free lunch. In the city center, a Stadtbahn can be just as fast or frequent as an automated light metro system, but that also means building the tunnel or elevated guideway that you would have had to build for that automated light metro system. The real advantage to Stadtbahns comes when you leave the city center. In suburban and lower density areas between urban nodes, a Stadtbahn can run on the surface, down the middle, or off to the side of a street, and if it has good grade separation and signal priority, it can still be really fast. But this often requires more in-depth and careful planning. With a metro, it's either going to be above ground, below ground, or on the surface, but with a Stadtbahn, it might be in the middle of the road, the side of the road, above the road. There's a lot more complexity in creating a good design, and a lot more variability where you can have a bad Stadtbahn or a good one. But this careful and fine-grained design also means that Stadtbahns can be built super cost-effectively, or not so cost-effectively. If you can build cost-effectively, even a big development can afford to, say, add a new branch to the system, which is a pretty cool feature. And something you'll see on Stadtbahns that you really won't see on metros is things like temporary stations or construction tracks, where routes are rerouted around a construction site, whereas with a metro, you'd probably just shut the line down for a few months. And I think the low cost of adding new branches and routes kind of highlights the distributed nature of the Stadtbahn model that makes it so attractive. Any given route is probably going to have less service, but you can have more routes that directly cover more of your city. And this works really well in orderly Germany, where the trams come on time, and so you don't have to worry about a lower frequency service being a much lower service quality. All of this leads to a less spiky, more distributed urban form that means less transit, but in more places. What's nice about a Stadtbahn, though, is that you never really preclude upgrading the system into a full metro. For example, turning the core sections into a subway and the peripheral ones into a new tram system. That's the kind of urban flexibility that for a city where the future is uncertain is really nice to have. And because these models are really good, they've been adopted really widely. Cities like Rotterdam and Valencia have adopted the Stadtbahn model, while cities like Vancouver and Copenhagen have gone for automated light metros. The natural question though is, which is better? And like always, it depends. If you're just trying to serve an existing urban form, the question kind of is, what does your urban form look like? If you have a few corridors of concentrated density, then an automated light metro probably makes a lot of sense. Whereas a Stadtbahn is a more natural transit solution to a more decentralized urban area, or one where there are multiple towns and villages all interlinked and in each other's orbit. Of course though, if your city is growing, then the solution you choose will shape its growth. A metro will mean less corridors of more intense development, and a Stadtbahn will mean less intense development over more corridors. There isn't really a city that, to my knowledge, incorporates both of these transit models, but it's an interesting thought experiment. And to be fair, these solutions aren't necessarily just for small cities. In Seoul, for example, you'll see a ton of little light metro lines that provide connections to different communities and major trip generators that aren't on the main subway network. I think you see this a lot less with Stadtbahns because there's a lot more complexity. Not only do you have to plan the central core, but also branches, and you have to do a lot more fine-grained design when it comes to roadways and right-of-ways. In a big city, you also don't get the benefit of being able to pop above ground in a low-density suburb where there isn't a ton of traffic and run along the street. You can't exactly do that in most of Seoul, even if it's not in a core area. All of this means I think automated light metro probably makes sense in more cases and it's more replicable, but Stadtbahns can ultimately be more interesting and more powerful when executed well. But what do you think? Could your city benefit from one of these systems? Let me know down in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching.